Test 1, 2. All righty. Clock up front says we are actually a little behind this morning. It's been one of those days I've been running, I think, behind since I first woke up. All right. Prayer list. Delbert Rader. Okay. Battling cancer. Judy, that name again you gave me, Charles Henry family. Charles Henry passed away. And so prayers for that family. Mr. Staley, how is he progressing? Any updates to Ed? I know he's home, but he was home last week. Brenda, and she is at 106 Christian Health. I see in the bulletin Greg Perry got a good report from his surgery. Yeah. I heard. Okay, Rhonda Gates passed away Friday. Let's see. Lena they're still working on her treatment plan. She's in her treatment plan now. Okay. A lot of people on the road this weekend. It's spring break coming up, so we'll have a lot of people traveling over the next several days. Potentially could be a little bit rough weather-wise this afternoon and again about middle of the week, so just everybody think about that. Anything else?
Keep my daughter in the prayers, Jessica Brenner. She's in the hospital fighting colon cancer. She's only got probably 24 to 48 hours left.
Okay.
She's dying. She's 44.
Okay. Anybody else? Anything else? Mr. Pete, would you get us started with a prayer this morning?
We could share each other's burdens build on the faith of people to each other as Christians. We ask you to forgive us when we fall short.
All right, thank you, sir. All right, we're continuing on with Christian character. We had wrapped up Holy Lives last week and got started into our next section, and we got into a little bit, that really helps if that's turned on, about compassion being one of the characteristics of Christian life. And I guess, one of the questions we talk about is, as we look around us today, is there a lack of compassion in the world? And I think we would all probably nod our heads and say, yeah, there's a lack of compassion. The tougher question, though, comes when we look at the church and we look at Christianity, and my tougher question to you would then be, is there sometimes a lack of compassion among Christians? And I think, honestly, if we all looked at it pretty close and all gave it some really deep thought and pondered it, that we would sadly come up with the answer, quite possibly, there is. That maybe we sometimes are people lacking in compassion. So we're going to go back and we're going to look again at part of the story about the Good Samaritan. If you want to flip over to Luke chapter 10, we're going to go back over there and look at it again some today. And we're going to look at the first part of this. We're going to look at the first part, beginning of verse 25. And there at verse 25 it says that an expert in the law stood up to test him, saying, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he asked him. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." "You've answered correctly," he told him. "Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" So we got a lot going on here, a lot of underlying current. And in our last study, we talked a lot about how the religious leaders of their day were working really hard to do what to Jesus by this point? Well, they're trying to kill him, yeah. But they were trying to do what to help get the public opinion swayed for them to do so? They're trying to trap him. They want him to say something. The Jewish leaders recognize at this point that they really can't kill Jesus outright because public opinion is greatly with him at this point. They need for him to do something. They need for Jesus to say something that will turn public opinion against him. So it says here in that first verse, it tells us this religious expert is doing what? He's standing up to test him. Because when you look at the question, isn't this something, if he's an expert in the law, isn't this something he should have known? If he's an expert, he should know the answer to this question he's asking. So he has the ulterior motive. He wants to test him. And then what's to say about his motive on the second part of his question, the second question? After Jesus asked him, "What does the law say?" the guy spouts off, he gives the law, and then he asks what? Luke even tells us, but wanting to do what? Justify himself. He's not really honestly asking a question. He's not really seeking an answer. Not only is he trying to trap Jesus, he's trying to present himself and say, "Look how good I am." He's trying to justify himself with what he presents here. Now, real quick, I want to go back, and as we're talking about compassion, I want to remind you we talked about Tertullian last week and how in his observation in defense of Christianity, he observed that the pagan world was often impressed by the love and unity. demonstrated by early Christians. So as we're framing this look up at this parable of the Good Samaritan, we need to understand that Christians in the first century were living in such a way that even pagans recognized there was something different. And that his observation highlighted the importance of love and unity as characteristics of Christians. So as we're looking and we're setting all this up, we want to frame this with the fact that as Christians, the early church was recognized even by those who were nowhere close to Christian as people that were loving and compassionate. So I talked with somebody about this week, this question, and I asked them, have we become too familiar with this parable? What do you think? We've all heard this parable since we were how old? Since we were all that tall. The parable of the Good Samaritan. These guys were going, basically synopsis what we heard as kids is this guy got beat up by robbers on the road. This guy went by this way. This guy went by this way. They didn't stop. And this really good guy who shouldn't have really stopped to help him, stopped and helped him. We should be like that guy. So, have we really gotten too familiar with it? Do we miss out on some of the underlying messages? Do we miss out on the true depth of what is going on here? What do you think? Is this something we sort of let go by? We might pick and choose what we do, yeah. But I think in some aspects we've sort of, because we've heard this so long since we were kids, and because, it's just been there, I think we have sort of, I don't know if too familiar, taking this parable for granted, just thinking, it's whatever. But I think we've sort of, in some aspects, let this sort of just slide off our back. Let this just roll on off our back as we look at this. Because Jesus obviously had a reason to tell this parable and the importance of it. So have we become too familiar with it? Is that maybe part of the reason sometimes we lack compassion in consideration for others is we forget Jesus told this story for a purpose. Have compassion and kindness from Christians become the exception rather than the norm? Both in terms of physical and spiritual needs. Have they slipped away? Now, see, this is part of the problem that Jesus addresses with the religious leaders of the day. He's often critical of them for what? He's not critical of them for not knowing the law, but he's critical of what? Their lack of love and compassion. They know it. They can cite it. They can spout it off, but they don't know how to live it. Bring that forward to today. Are there times, are there places, are there churches who can quote Scripture, who can tell you what everything needs to be done, how you need to be saved, and all of that? But are there churches and are there Christians who have lost their compassion? Have we lost our compassion for those who are hungry, for those who are homeless, for those who are struggling with spiritual issues? And I'm not talking just about, the physical issues. I'm talking about sometimes we may be lacking in compassion for those who have spiritual needs. It's real easy to focus on the legalistic side of things and get into that and forget there is supposed to be love and compassion. And Jesus also told them, they will know you are my disciples by what? Your love. Not by how many verses of Scripture you can quote off from memory.
You can't answer for the whole world, but when you look at pockets like this church right here,
Yeah.
this is one of the most giving congregations that I know.
Yeah, and I'll agree. But I think you can also look at pockets around and find churches that have lost that compassion. No.
You can only answer for your own family.
Yes. So Jesus expressed, as you look at his teaching and as he walked through his life, Jesus expressed great compassion for both the physical and spiritual needs of those around him. You know, look at the instances where Jesus met somebody's physical need and then addressed their spiritual need. Encounters where Jesus had, like the woman at the well, where he addressed her needs, both physically and spiritually. People that Jesus healed, where he would heal them and then he would address their spiritual need. Because of his compassion. We as Christians are to exhibit the compassion for both their physical needs and their spiritual needs. Is it easier to address someone's spiritual needs if we have compassion for their physical needs first? Question for you. If you encounter someone who's hungry, someone who does not know where they're going to lay their head that night, are you more likely to get receptiveness to the spiritual things if you say, here, we'll find you something to eat and somewhere to sleep? By the way, the reason I'm doing this is because Jesus has done so much for me. Let me tell you what he's done and what he'll do for you. That's a lot easier to address someone on their spiritual needs if you've met a physical need that they can't figure out what they're going to do for the next few hours. That is that compassion that we are to have. John 11:33, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Here John writes of an instance where Jesus saw this and was deeply moved in spirit and troubled because of his compassion. Matthew 14:14, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and he had what? Compassion on them. And he healed their sick. Compassion on them and healed their sick. Matthew 9:36, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Here we're talking more about a spiritual situation where he had compassion on them because they're just ambling around and lost spiritually. Do we today have the compassion that we ought to have for people who are lost and are ambling around spiritually? Do we have that compassion? Because that compassion should be then our driving force to have the desire to tell them, to teach them about Jesus. We should care for them. And again, like I said, we should care physically and we should care spiritually. Are we having the compassion Jesus had for these because they were harassed and helpless? If you look around us today, if you look around us anywhere you go, you will see people in this spiritual situation where they're harassed, where they're helpless, where they're just wandering around like lost sheep. And part of our compassion, our responsibility with that compassion is we should be able to point them in the right direction.
When
Yeah.
I think about compassion, I have a book that I bought years ago, written by a man named Cameron Roberts. It said, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
There you go. And I think that's a great example that Jesus would set, was he would address people's physical needs first and then address their spiritual need. And I think sometimes we have lost track of that. Jerry? Well, yeah. But the willingness to accept it is on them. The willingness for us to point them the way is on us. You know, that's back to the harvest is the Lord's. It's up to us to do all that we can do, and then what comes of that is His. But it is our responsibility to have the compassion for them. and to point them to Him. Yeah, you're right. They have to be receptive, but that's the part that's on the other individual. We can't just say, oh, they're not going to be receptive, so I'm not going to feed them or I'm not going to tell them about Jesus. You can't do that. That's on us. The doing that part is on us. The receptiveness then falls to them. But it's our responsibility to have the compassion on them for physical and spiritual needs both. Luke 23, 33 and 34, Father, forgive them. Even as Jesus is dying, He has what? Compassion. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. When you look at that and when you look at what Jesus says there as He's being crucified, how many of us would have had that kind of outlook? Most of us would have been, Father, strike them down, wipe them out. Remember the encounter on the road when the disciples say, do you want us to call down fire and strike them down? Most of us in that situation when we're being crucified, we would have been screaming, Father, judge them. Father, avenge me. And Jesus says, Father, forgive them because they don't know. An ultimate compassionate statement. Jesus cares for the physical and spiritual well-being of all people. And if we are following His example, so should we. And the point coming here is we shouldn't cherry pick the people we care about. Did you hear me? We should not cherry pick the people we care about. In other words, we shouldn't just care physically and spiritually about the people who look like us, for the people that dress like us, for the people that walk like us, for the people that come from the same side of town as us. We should not just have the compassion for those people. Think about the people this morning in Myanmar. 7.7 earthquake, and I'm sure many of you have seen the one video where you see this building just wobbling, and then all of a sudden, boom, gone. There are people there who, we don't know how many died. There are people there who lost everything, who are sleeping on the streets today. Our compassion for them should be the same as it is for anybody who lives in our neighborhood. Our compassion should be for everyone. Jesus had compassion for who? Everybody. He didn't die just for select people. So, what do we learn about the expert in the law in this text? What do we learn about him? Well, one, he's seeking to test Jesus because Luke just flat tells us he's testing. He's seeking to test Jesus. You know, the question is, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Pretty good question, wouldn't you think? If you're asking it from an honest motive. But the question is, what should I do? He knew the laws of God, and he spent his time studying and teaching the law. This is a question that, as an expert of the law, he should have really, like I said earlier, he should have really known the answer to. The second thing we must observe in the story is the motive, because the question in itself looks harmless and looks pretty good, but the motive to test Jesus and to try to trap him, we need to understand that's why he's asking it here. And then Jesus' reply, classic example of a perfect reply. You ever asked somebody a question and had it turned right back on you? Probably in school, some of your teachers would go to them and say, now, teacher, what do you think? And they would say, well, what do you think out of this? What do you see? And so here with Jesus' reply, he says, what is written in the law? And how do you read it? So here you've got a situation. He's trying to trap Jesus, and suddenly Jesus completely does what? turns the tables. Now he's put the spotlight on the religious leader, and can you imagine, there are others there, and now they've all turned from looking at Jesus to they've turned to looking at this guy and go, okay, what are you going to say? So things have turned here. You can imagine his reaction, can't you? He's fired off this question. He's trying to trap Jesus, and now he's like, Ever seen somebody trapped in that situation where they go, they stem and stammer and, you can see him doing this at this point because this is not what he expected. One writer said he had thrown a question at Jesus, trying to catch him out in his religious beliefs, and Jesus turned the conversation around and put him in the spotlight instead. So now he's got to come up with an answer, and he does. He quotes, he says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might." That's from Deuteronomy 6:5. Oh, quotes. And then out of Leviticus 19:18, "Do not seek revenge or bear grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself." So, he's got the spotlight on him. He pulls out a couple of good answers out of the law. All right, got it knocked out. And Jesus says, "You've answered correctly. Do this and you will live." Now, it's one of those situations you look at this religious leader and say, "Dude, you couldn't stop, could you? You just had to keep going. You've weaseled out of this one, but he's got to go a little further." And his next question is really about himself and not about compassion for others. And again, how do we know that? Because Luke writes it down. But wanting to do what? To justify himself. He's going to ask this question not because he really wants to know, but he's trying to position himself, justify himself, make himself look good in this situation. And then he asks the question, who is my neighbor? And at this point you can see Jesus probably smile and say, now we're going to get here. Now I'm going to tell you. But he wanted to justify, and he asked, who is my neighbor? And Jesus is getting ready to tell him who your neighbor is. And here's the kicker. He's not going to be expecting the answer that he gets. It suggests he's trying to define the boundaries of who he needs to love rather than focusing on the act of loving itself. What he's wanting to do is he's wanting Jesus to tell him here, you need to love this group of people. And he's thinking, yeah, Jesus is going to tell me to love my fellow Jews, and I'm going to say, I'm doing that. But Jesus has a little surprise for him here in his answer. And really what Jesus comes out and tells him is this. Through this parable, he points out there are to be no boundaries in regards to who we are to love and have compassion for. Because ultimately what happens here in the story, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, is the person who should have done nothing by the standards and the way things were at that time and that day is the one who helps. Now, let's get this qualified before we go further into this. This does not mean that we approve of wrongful behavior. When we talk about there are to be no boundaries with who we love, this does not mean we approve of wrongful behavior, but that our love is even to extend to those involved in things that are not right. Jesus even told us to love who? Our enemies. I don't know about you, but I have trouble. This one's hard. This means we're even to love people that have cost us promotions, that have maybe gotten us fired at work, or people who have done wrong from us, people who have stolen from us. We are to love our enemies. How many of you have trouble with that? I see hands going up. Yeah. It's not easy, is it? But Jesus tells us all through, this is not easy to follow me, but it's different. And so he asked, who is my neighbor? We do what is good and right to everyone. We show mercy even when mercy is not shown to us. We do not retaliate. We do not treat people as they treat us. We show mercy when we are not treated right. That is part of the compassionate life, the part of the compassionate characteristics we are supposed to have as Christians, is we just do it because we do it and because it's right, regardless of how people have done us. Now, what's the world tell us we're supposed to do to all those people? The world tells us, get them back. Don't treat somebody nice who treated you wrong. Get revenge. That's how the world tells us. The world looks at this approach and says, that seems awfully weak. You're just going to let people walk right over you and stomp right on you. But that's how Jesus says we're to live. Why do you think the priest and the Levite would pass on by? Why do you think in this story they pass on by? Because they think their way is the right way. Now we got to remember, this is a parable. So this is not, there was not an actual Levite and there was not an that did this. Jesus is telling this parable to make a point. But if you look at the story, what the Levite and the priest pass on by, well, what was one of the things about touching a dead or dying body? It would make you what? Ceremonially unclean. So if they touched this person and they died, or they were dead by the time they didn't know, it would make them unclean and they would not be able to do what? Do their responsibilities. Be in the temple. They'd be ritually unclean. Well, that's pretty important to a priest and a Levite, isn't it? Don't want to be unclean, can't do that, don't want to spend those days outside. And I think, and this is just me editorializing here, I think that's part of the reason Jesus tells this parable, is to get this thing of there's legalism and then there is rightism. Yes? That could be, yeah, that's possible. That would be our culture today. And nobody's going to know. But I really think with the situation and the guy trying to trap Jesus in his views legalistically, I think the legalism part of this is where Jesus is going. Is, okay, this thing about the law and touching a dead body, doing that over having compassion for someone who has a need on the road, you're missing out. They were more caught up, the Levites, the priests were caught up in the legalism and following things to the letter of the law. They were missing out that there was supposed to be love and compassion. And so I think that here is what the point is Jesus is getting to. These were experts in the law. These were guys who knew. These were guys trying to live their life properly, and they're letting this guy die on the road. And I think the point of the parable is don't let the guy die on the road. Could it be the priest and the Levite likely assumed the injured man was either dead or near death? Therefore, if I touch him, I'm going to be unclean. He's going to die anyway. I'll just go over here. And like you said, we're out here in the road in the middle of nowhere. Nobody sees me except him. He's going to die. Nobody's going to tell anybody. So they're worried about being legalistic and being clean in terms of ritualism. In turn, becoming ritually unclean would have meant they could not perform their priestly duties or enter the temple, which was a significant concern for both of them. And again, I think we're getting to the crux here of why Jesus is telling this parable. That's not what's important. That's not what's important in this situation. The Samaritan, however, disregarded the potential ritual impurity and instead acted with compassion.
Jesus showed compassion to the money changers when he ran them out of the temple. Did he still love what they had become?
No. But they weren't laying on the side of the road injured either. They were taking advantage of people. By the way, I just saw that episode of The Chosen the other day, and it's pretty intense. In The Chosen, they portray that scene as really disruptive. And if you think about it as you're watching that scene, that was probably a pretty disruptive scene. We all think he just went in, flipped over a couple of tables, and left. But there were 1 million people in that city. Here's your difference. The people and the money changers that were taking advantage of those in the temple didn't need compassion, they needed correction. This man on the side of the road in the parable needed the compassion. Yes, Stacy? Yeah. Spiritual correction is compassionate. Yeah, the teacher of the law also needed that too. Jesus is also correction here. And he's pointing out that legalism is not where the law was intended to be. But this.
When you talk about Jesus teaching the law, he spent more time teaching about the spirit of the law.
Yeah, which is what they had lost. They had lost the true spirit of the law. They were caught up in the legalisms, and here's part of the problem. They were caught up in the things they had added to the law. They were caught up in sticking to traditions that God had not intended to be anywhere connected to the law. Not only does the Samaritan stop and check on the man on the road, he tends to his needs and then provides the care. You know, Jesus, as he tells his story, the Samaritan doesn't just stop and say, oh, you're okay, let me bandage your wound. Okay, let's see if we can get an ambulance or ambulant donkey out here, an ambudonkey out here to get you transported. He gets him to where he can get care in this story, and then tells the man that he leaves him with, here's this money. If it takes more than this, what? I'll pay you when I come back. That's the kind of compassion we're to have. The surprising nature of this parable, considering the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans. The Samaritans should have done what? If you go by how they treated each other. God said, you don't even talk to me. The Jews looked at the Samaritans like dogs. And yet he's the one who stops. And I think thereby is another underlying message in this parable that sometimes we let slide on by, and where we become too familiar with the parable is, this is a man who the Jews would not have stopped to help to save their life. And he's the one who stopped. He's the one who stopped. Legalism versus love. If you look at the Levite and the priest, they were, you can read into this parable that they were thinking of staying ceremonially clean. Well, they say the law says this: if I touch him and he's dying and then I'm unclean, I can't go to the temple, I can't do my duties. They're caught up in the legalism aspect of it. And what Jesus is pointing out here in the parable is, no. There's the love part of it, the compassion part of it. You know, you look at Matthew 23:27, where he says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of dead and everything unclean. Jesus is looking right into the eyes of the people who know the text of the law, who have studied. Their entire lives are dedicated to knowing the law. And what he's saying here to them is, You got all this law knowledge, but you don't have any practical purpose. You don't understand what the law is telling to you. And he compares them to whitewashed tombs. Beautiful on the outside, but in the inside you're dead. And then if you look to the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's the same thing. They look like they are trying to adhere to the law, but inside they got no compassion and they got no love. Inside they are dead and full of everything unclean. So, a couple of minutes. Who is our neighbor? Who is our neighbor? Our neighbor is anyone. Anyone. It's not just the people who live in your physical neighborhood, it's anyone else on this planet. Our neighbor is anyone. Not just the people who look like us, talk like us, live like us, etc. It's anyone. One writer said, humans are very clannish. We bring our people close, we exclude those we don't like and or those we perceive as threats. We take care of our own. And then he goes on to say, there is very little time left to tend to the needs of those we feel are outside that circle. After all, why should we waste valuable resources on people we don't know when it doesn't benefit us or our group? Sad to say, there are a lot of people who view their compassion within these definitions and constraints. Our neighbors are not those we choose, but the ones that are in our immediate proximity at any moment in time. And immediate proximity does not mean just physical proximity. But we don't choose, as Jesus defines them, as God defines them, as our neighbors are defined spiritually, we don't choose them. We don't get to say, he's my neighbor, he's not. They're not chosen by anything except chance. We encounter someone, they're our neighbor. We encounter someone in need, they're our neighbor. We don't choose. Our neighbor is, and we'll end up right here, our neighbor is anyone, even our enemies. And as Jesus points out in this parable, the Samaritan should have been an enemy to this man on the road, and he's the one who stopped and took care of him. So as we have our compassion for those around us, as we exhibit compassion as one of our Christian characteristics, our compassion and our love should go to everyone, because our neighbor is anyone, even those that we consider enemies. And the clock says we are out of time.